Parker and I'm a lecturer in English at Loughborough University. This is my second video on Charlotte Mew's poem, The Farmer's Bride. In the first video, I discussed the poem as a dramatic monologue. In this video, I'm going to look at the poem's form and metre and consider how these relate to the meaning of the poem. Before we get into a close reading of the poem, however, I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean by the terms form and metre. By form, I basically mean how the poem looks on the page. If you hold it out and look at it from a distance, what shape does it make? Are the lines even lengths or do they vary? Is the poem split into stanzas? If so, how many are there? This is a good starting point to give us clues to the overall form of the poem. In Mew's poem, we can see there are 6 stanzas, but they're all completely different lengths. Most stanzas in the poem are 8 to 10 lines long, but the shortest, stanza 4, is 4 lines long, and the final stanza is 5 lines. Why might this be? Perhaps we might argue that the shorter lines reflect the farmer's growing sense of impatience with his bride as he becomes increasingly desperate to get close to her. The length of the lines also gives us a clue about the poem's metre. When I say metre, I mean the rhythm of the words across each line of the poem. Metre is what makes a poem different from prose written in sentences, like novels and short stories. Poems tend to be split into lines that use patterns of sound that we call metre. Though these patterns aren't always regular, they might be fairly varied, as they are in Mew's poem. When scanning a poem, we split lines up into units called feet. The pattern of feet is the metre. A foot is a combination of stressed and unstressed syllables. You have probably heard of the iamb, which means a less stressed followed by a more stressed syllable. People usually learn to identify iambs when studying Shakespeare, whose plays are written in lines of Iambic Pentameter, which means 5 iambs per line. If we turn to Charlotte Mew's poem, we can see that she uses iambs too. Let's look at the first couple of lines of the poem. 3 summers since I chose a maid, too young maybe, but more's to do. Read these lines through out loud and put a mark above the words that you think are more emphasized. These will usually be the words when you feel your mouth doing something, like your lips or tongue are pushing the words out. Then mark the other less stressed syllables with a cross above them. What do you get? It might look something like this. So you can see we have 4 iambs here rather than 5. We call this Iambic Tetrameter. Iambic Tetrameter is actually one of the most common meters for poetry, even more common than Iambic Pentameter. It's often used for nursery rhymes and for ballads, for any song-like poem really, as it's one of the simplest, most musical of the meters. But we might ask, why does Mew use this meter for her poem? Why write a song-like poem about the difficult, even disturbing relationship between the farmer and his bride? We might think about how Mew is telling a story in the poem. It makes sense that she would use a meter associated with the ballad, which is historically a narrative poem, passed along by word of mouth, used to tell stories of crimes, heroic battles, doomed romances. Like the composer of a ballad, Mew needs to keep the reader interested in the narrative events of the farmer's bride, and the simple, regular meter draws the reader along and helps us follow the story. Mew also uses rhyme in a similar way. As we can see here, every stanza uses a slightly different rhyming pattern, and there's lots of rhyming couplets occurring throughout. Rhymes help to quicken the pace of the poem and again draw the reader along to the next line, so that events, like the rhyming pairs themselves, feel inevitable and unstoppable as the poem's tragedy unfolds. Consider the 4th stanza, for example. Shy as a leveret, swift as he, straight and slight as a young larch tree, sweet as the first wild violets she, to her wild self, but what to me? So you can see here how all 4 lines rhyme, he, tree, she, and me, and this increases the pace of the poem, and we might say the increased pace reflects the farmer's growing frustration and impatience, culminating in what to me. So the bouncy iambic tetrameter and the frequent rhymes of the Farmer's Bride added together keep the reader on the narrative ride, even when they want to get off once events start to take a more sinister turn. But surely we might ask, doesn't the iambic tetrameter beat and the frequent rhymes make the poem sound a bit too jolly, a bit too upbeat for such a disturbing tale? It might be that that's precisely the point. Remember, we're listening to the farmer here who desperately wants his new bride to conform to a normal pattern, like the four seasons themselves described throughout the poem. Perhaps he's trying to force her into iambic tetrameter in a similar way. I've said that the poem is largely composed of lines of iambic tetrameter, but Mew at key moments varies the meter to show us that all is not quite well. Look at the sixth line, for example, like the shut of a winter's day. This sounds abrupt, even violent. Why not close of a winter's day or end rather than the harsh sounding shut? The meter contributes to this jarring effect. If you scan the line, it looks like this, like the shut of a winter's day. This line has 3 feet rather than 4. The first 2 feet, with 2 less stressed and 1 stressed syllables, are called anapests. What's the effect of this shift in meter? We might say that Mew changes the meter to make the reader sense that all is not well, even at this early point in the poem, and the anapest means that shut is given even more emphasis, as we have to wait for those first less stressed syllables before we get to shut. Another example of variation can be found in the second stanza of the poem. Look at line 14. So over 7-acre field and up along across the down. This is the longest line in the poem. If we scan it, we see there's 8 iambs in it. That's double the amount for the majority of the poem in iambic tetrameter. We call this iambic octameter. But what's far more important than knowing the fancy sounding name is to ask yourself, why does Mew include such a long line at this point in the poem? Think about what's being described here, a long chase across the downs to find the missing bride. So we might argue that the protracted line of iambs reflects this ongoing chase. The second stanza is also full of enjambment or run-on lines, reflecting the ongoing chase across each line until we reach the final full stop or end stop line, as the key is finally turned fast, meaning both speedily and securely on the recaptured bride. Enjambment is also used interestingly in the final stanza of the poem to emphasize the narrow distance between the farmer and his bride. The stair betwixt them is represented by the split across the lines. There are many other things we could say about the poem in terms of form, such as sound effects like alliteration and assonance, repetition of certain phrases and images, and even aspects of punctuation such as caesura. But hopefully this video has given you some ideas about how to link form, meter, and meaning together when looking at a fascinating and complex poem like Charlotte Mew's The Farmer's Bride.